Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto turns into a fox during a full moon. Pre-timescope, no Biju, Konoha is a village of ninjas who hunt demons. Naruto is a ninja with secrets. And tonight is the night of a full moon. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 7, Fox Tales. Naruto slumped in his seat and stared blankly at the swirls in the wood grain of the desk in front of him. He was in a lot of trouble. But he didn't feel like caring about it at the moment. As soon as he'd reverted to human form, Kakashi-sensei had dragged him off to see the Hokage. The two adults grilled him about the cave and what he knew about it. And Naruto told them everything, as there was no reason not to anymore. They got really mad at him. He was just a child. He didn't have the experience necessary to judge whether or not a supernatural creature was dangerous. It didn't matter that Orochimaru was old and sick, the werewolf was still a threat. Keeping the cursed creature secret was incredibly irresponsible and could have resulted in other people contracting lycanthropy. The Hokage had nearly stripped him of his shinobi status. Naruto made no real protests as the old man reprimanded him. He felt so numb that not even the prospect of losing access to the training that he needed to rescue his mother seemed to touch him. All he felt was loneliness. Orochimaru had sort of been his friend. The old werewolf hadn't known that he was human, but he'd known all about Naruto's furry side, and hadn't cared. He had appreciated Naruto's visits, the little things like fresh batteries that he brought, and kept him occupied with checkers all night long. The werewolf hadn't cared that Naruto was a freak, or judged him. It was great. It had been great. He died while I was away. Naruto leaned forward and buried his face in his arms. He died all alone. A finger poked him in the side. Hey, you okay? Naruto took a second to compose himself and peeked up to find Chuji looking down at him with concern. I'm fine, Naruto told him, managing to smile. You sure? The chubby kid asked and munched on a potato chip. You look really down. Oh, my goldfish died, Naruto lied, letting his smile fall away. My first pet ever, and it dies. Oh. The Akimichi boy offered him one of his chips. I'm sorry. Thanks, Naruto said and popped the chip in his mouth. Why couldn't I have been put on a team with Chuji, or the other guys? When he'd first started attending the academy, it had been hard to find any friends. All the other students had been going there all their lives. There were no new kids, especially not in the higher grades. But then he'd shared some cookies with Chuji and made a friend. Almost immediately after that he'd become buddies with Shikamaru, because Shikamaru was Chuji's best buddy and they always hung out together. And then a few weeks after that, Naruto had befriended Kiba, even though Kiba made fun of his whiskers and sometimes commented that he smelled funny. The four of them were the best of buddies and the troublemakers of the class. Shikamaru would nap through class, Chuji was always eating, Kiba was always loud, and Naruto did a bit of all three things. Naruto knew he should pay attention and be a good student because he was behind everyone else and his goal was to become strong, but class was just so boring. Naruto had hoped that he'd be teamed up with at least one of them when he'd graduated, even if Kiba had gotten a bit jerky once he'd gotten Akamaru. It had been a big disappointment to get stuck with Sasuke. He'd tried to make that a positive, as being teamed with his rival, and cute Sakura-chan, would make it easier for him to measure himself against the Uchiha than if they were on different squads. But his team situation was back to being a negative again, a big negative. After months of being put on teams, all of his classmates would sit with their teammates during the lecture classes. With Sasuke constantly trying to intimidate him, Naruto didn't want to sit with Team 7 if he didn't have to, so he always scrambled to find an open seat between other squads when it was time for class. He couldn't stand Sasuke always glaring at him and Sakura trying to ignore what Sasuke was doing anymore. I really wish Sasuke would just go back to ignoring me. Today he'd been fortunate to find an aisle seat open next to Chuji. Shikamaru was the only person better for him if Chuji hadn't been free because he'd just sleep. If his desk neighbor had been Kiba, Naruto probably would have punched him at some point because of his low mood. I wish I could cut lecture, Naruto thought sourly as he slipped his hand into his pocket and gripped the black horse head chess piece. It's so stupid. Not even leaving the village had spared him from the lectures on the various varieties of demons. When his team had been in wave, the teachers had made up note packets for them on all the subjects that they'd missed. Upon their return, they had certain deadlines to study those notes and take little quizzes on them to make sure that they'd actually read and learned from the packets. Naruto had been so distracted by fiddling with his weird fire powers on top of his usual training that he'd barely gotten all the quizzes done with scores high enough to pass. "Alright, class," Iruka called out as he wheeled in a slide projector, bringing the room full of genin to attention. "I hope you enjoyed your last lesson, Tsuchigamo and Jorogamo, their similarities and differences. Today we'll be covering something a little bit different." While Iruka set up the projector and checked his slides, Naruto sat up straighter in his chair. Lectures that had slideshows in them were always more interesting than those that were just talking and writing on the chalkboard. Once the machine was set up, the scar-nosed Chunin picked up a piece of chalk and wrote out the subject he was going to cover. "Extinct demons, Kitsune," Iruka said as he scrawled it out. Naruto blinked. "Iruka-sensei," a winner from Team 3 called out. "If Kitsune are extinct, why do we have to learn about them? If they're extinct, they're all dead." "Kitsune are important to the early history of Konoha," the Chunin replied as he pulled down the white screen for the projector. "And just because they are believed to be extinct doesn't necessarily mean that they are. Many races of dragons were once thought to be extinct, and then turned up alive after centuries up in some remote stretches of some mountain ranges in the lands of earth and lightning." Iruka turned down the classroom lights and turned on the slide projector, although no pictures appeared immediately. "Now, Kitsune were fox demons," Iruka said, sliding into lecture mode, "that were wiped out a little over 200 years ago. They were tricksters and menaces, and after committing a string of crimes against the nobility of the lands of earth, fire, lightning, grass, and tea, the shinobi forces of the day began a great hunt. The first years of the great hunt were filled with many battles, climaxing in the bloody fight where Senju Hashirama, the Shodei Hokage, and Uchiha Madara slew the terrible Kyuubi no Yoko, a nine-tailed kitsune of immense evil power. And for years after that they focused most of their attentions on ferreting out any kitsune and destroying them until no more could be found and they were declared extinct." When Iruka mentioned the battle between the Kyuubi no Yoko and the founding Hokage and an Uchiha, he showed the first slide. The picture was old, an artist's rendering, because cameras hadn't been invented yet. It was of a snarling red-orange monster that barely looked like a fox with 9 long, lashing tails. It was surrounded by very small-looking people that were like bugs in comparison to the beast. On one side a man looked like it was attacking the Kyuubi with fire and some shadowy power, and on the other a man seemed to be trying to bind the monster with mud, or it could have been wood. Once the teacher was sure that his students had had a good enough look at that image, he advanced to the next slide. Kitsune, being fox demons, had 2 main features that always set them apart from ordinary foxes. Their extra tails. He poked his finger into the light of the projector to highlight that feature in another artist's drawing of a different kitsune, a gray one with 5 tails that looked a lot less monstrous than the Kyuubi picture, and their larger size. Also they could come in some more exotic colors than an ordinary fox, like blue, purple, pink, and green. And unlike foxes, kitsune could speak the human language, and even transform into human form. The projector clicked again and the gray kitsune was replaced by a brown one with 4 tails, and a beautiful woman in a fine kimono with brown hair standing beside it, with lines between them that implied that they were the same being. Were kitsune still alive today, they would be classified as A-class demons, with potential for some individuals to become S-class demons, like the Kyuubi no Yoko. They possessed illusion and shape-shifting powers comparable to the Tanuki, which still survives today. They were incredibly clever, able to use their powers to insinuate themselves into important niches in human societies and create all manner of chaos. And, in addition to those powers, they also were gifted with a wide variety of elemental magics, mainly either fire or lightning. Iruka changed the picture again to a black kitsune that appeared to be surrounded by 5 orbs of blue ethereal fire. "A fun little fact," the Chunin said cheerfully, as he jumped to the next slide that depicted a peach-colored kitsune playing with a violet-hued ball of lightning. Whether a kitsune could make fire or lightning, it was called the same thing, kitsune ubi, or foxfire. Naruto fidgeted with the chess piece in his pocket. The pictures were pretty and all, but the information was boring. The only thing that sounded remotely interesting was the bit about that Kyuubi no Yoko guy. Naruto hoped Iruka would talk more about him and the shinobi who'd kicked his tails after he got all the general information out of the way. Folklore about Kitsune, like folklore about all demons, is full of fantasy and lies and only contains fragments of truth, Iruka continued. For instance, old tales say that the way to determine if someone is truly a kitsune in disguise is that you must find their tail, as they were believed to be unable to hide the tail that they were born with. You must see how they react to dogs, as dogs will smell the fox in them and bark and the kitsune will become nervous, and you must watch their diet, as kitsune were supposedly fond of any sort of fried tofu. Naruto made a disgusted face. Fried tofu? Icky. Now the fondness for fried tofu is a meaningless clue, the Chunin said and clicked to a new slide of a person in a kimono with a fox tail. The hidden fox tail is a bit better, although it is believed that only very young and inexperienced kitsune, lazy kitsune, and old kitsune kept their first tail untransformed and hidden in clothing. Were they still alive today, it would be much harder for them to hide such a feature as clothes have become more close-fitting than they were in the past. The most reliable way to uncover a kitsune is with dogs. They couldn't hide their fox scent and dogs would pick up on it and try to chase down the vermin that they smelled. Iruka was about to move on, but spied a raised hand. Yes, Ami. What about the Uchiha's Sharingan eyes? Naruto cringed as he heard the voice of one of Sasuke's fans, a girl that had bullied Sakura the most. They would see through these kitsune's disguises in an instant, so they're much better than dogs. While kitsune do use illusions, they do not use illusions to take human form, the Chunin answered. When we use henge, we cast a shell of chakra around ourselves that makes us look different, and the Sharingan will see through that easily. But a kitsune would change their bone, hair, and flesh the same way that a human changes when they become consumed by lycanthropy. It isn't an illusion, and while the Sharingan might notice imperfections in the transformation or the individual's chakra, they would not be able to see the fox hiding under the human's skin. That would make the Inuzuka clan a much better detector for disguised kitsune, if there were any left to be found. Oh. Ami sounded horribly disappointed that her handsome Sasuke-kun wouldn't be able to protect her and gain glory by spying out extinct fox demons. Iruka paused and consulted his little paper of notes and his slides before finding his place and continuing, shifting the current slide to a picture of several different kitsune with varying numbers of tails. The best way to judge a kitsune's age and power was by the number of tails it possessed. One-tailed kitsune were the youngest and weakest of all the kitsune. Every century they lived, they would sprout a new tail and their reservoir of power would greatly expand. The highest level of power a kitsune could reach was to have 9 tails, like the Kyuubi no Yoko, and many accounts of such fox demons paint them almost as gods. They were so powerful, wise from their long lives, and dangerous. It takes a century to grow a new tail? Naruto scratched at the back of his head, puzzled. How'd they get that number? A kitsune's tails were also its greatest weapon, Iruka continued as he shifted the slides to show 2 kitsune battling each other, one with the white tips of its tails lengthened into sharp points like spears, and the other with the white parts of its tails split and curved into claws. With their shape-shifting magic, they could turn their tails into cutting blades or grasping claws. They could also extend their length to 3, even 4 times what they usually were, and control them the way an Uchiha uses its tentacles. Kitsune's tails were their most prized possession and a mark of status, and to cut one off would drive the kitsune to seek revenge for it, no matter what the cost, even though the tail would grow back fairly quickly. Another hand interrupted Iruka. Yes. What sort of regenerative powers did kitsune have if they could grow back lost tails? Some kid from Team 1 asked. While they could regrow tails like many reptile demons could regrow lost parts, that's the only limb that they could replace, Iruka answered. Any other healing power they have was closer to that of werewolves, I believe. Did silver hurt them? A boy from Team 5 said without raising his hand. No, kitsune had no specific weakness, the Chunin replied. Sometimes some would imbue part of their spirit and power into crystal orbs that could be stolen and used against them, but it was better to depend on attacking vital points like the heart, spine, and brain with overwhelming force than waste time seeking out some hidden crystal. Were they contagious? A girl from Team 9 called out, also not bothering with her hand. No, they were not curse-born like werewolves are, Iruka explained. Kitsune are born kitsune and there is no other way to become one. Their bite wasn't curse-laced or venomous, but they did have sharp teeth and strong jaws, so it wasn't a good idea to get bitten anyway. They could and did breed freely with humans, and for a few generations the fox blood would be strong enough in the children for them to be considered kitsune as well. He glanced around the darkened classroom. Are there any more questions or can I get back to my lecture? After an embarrassed silence, he advanced the slides to a painting of a many-tailed fox leaping at an ancient samurai. The crimes of the kitsune race varied wildly. Some would lead travelers astray with their orbs of ghostly fire and leave them to be preyed upon by others or rob them themselves. Some would steal something valuable from one home and then plant it in the neighbor's house to start a feud. Many would steal from merchants, some would steal by casting illusions on leaves to make them appear to be money to purchase goods with. Some would take the guise of beautiful women to become concubines to powerful nobles so that they could leech on the man's riches. Some would cheat and lie their way into positions of power in noble courts to spread gossip and destroy reputations. If wronged, some would go on rampages until their rages cooled. They were sly, selfish, slippery, shadowy bringers of chaos and crafters of subtle plots, and when they nearly toppled several countries' governments they finally reached their greedy paws too far and paid dearly for it. Naruto sagged very low in his seat and clenched the chess piece in his hand so hard that the points of the black plastic horse's head almost made his palm bleed. There are some old folk tales where kitsune were faithful spouses to kind people, or poets and artists, intellectuals of good reputation who never harmed a soul, the Chunin said. But such tales are not believable. Kitsune behaved only to their own advantage and viewed humans as tools to their plans or toys to manipulate to their own amusement. If they ever were wives, husbands, poets, artists, or people of knowledge, they played these roles as part of some scheme that could last centuries. As Iruka ran through more slides of kitsune disguised as humans or being nefarious and wicked, Naruto looked away to glower at his desk. How would you know what they were like? Demon hunters don't get to know demons. They just kill them. Sasuke hurled his kunai at the practice target with more force than was necessary while he and the other members of Team 7 waited for their tardy sensei to appear. Before he'd left home for lecture, his older brother had taken him aside for a talk. He was still grinding his teeth over it. If you want to impress father, it would be better if you did well in the upcoming trials than if you ruined your team's chance for even being entered in the hopes that you might find something about your teammate that I won't. The Uchiha grunted as he yanked his knives out of the target before pacing back to the throwing line to start over. Itachi had told him that Kakashi had been considering entering them into the trials that would be starting in barely 2 months. But because he was leaning on Naruto, the Jonin was changing his mind. I don't see why Kakashi would protect someone like him, Sasuke had groused. He's no real citizen of Konoha. Isn't he at all curious about what Naruto can do? I'm sure that he's plenty curious, Itachi had replied. But he knows better ways of finding out what he wants to know than you do. Let him do his job and focus on improving yourself and your team. Sasuke checked his kunai for damage and then started throwing them again, with just as much fury as before. Improving my team. He'd snorted. I have a bookworm that only wants my affection, and a strange orphan that is under suspicion. What's the point of improving them when I'll be leaving them behind the moment I get promoted? Think about what I said, Itachi had told him, and then jabbed him in the forehead with 2 fingers. Foolish little brother. The dark-haired boy hurled the last of his knives at his target and glowered at it, even though he'd grouped the knives tightly all around the bullseye without using his Sharingan. What is Itachi up to? He wondered. Is he trying to help me? Or is he trying to hold me back? He didn't want to think badly of his older brother. Itachi had always made time for them to play together, and he'd taught Sasuke more than his father ever had about the shinobi arts. But if he backed off Naruto, Itachi alone would get all the credit for anything that was discovered about him, and he would stay the perfect Uchiha son in their father's eyes. What should I do? Hey Sasuke, Naruto's voice budded in his thoughts. Who was this Uchiha Madara person? I was wondering that, too, Sakura added timidly. She was always timid with him unless she was already angry about something. He was my ancestor and an Uchiha, Sasuke answered, trying not to growl. He lived a long time ago and killed that kitsune that Iruka-sensei mentioned and thousands of other demons. That's it. It was probably true, but he didn't know for sure. He wasn't about to admit to them that he had no idea who Madara had been. He'd never heard the name before. The next time that he saw his brother he resolved to find out more. Poof. Sorry I'm late. Their sensei said cheerfully as he appeared on the scene. There was a crying little girl who'd lost her puppy and I had a terrible time finding it for her. Liar. Naruto and Sakura snapped, even though this excuse was almost believable. Sasuke watched Naruto, in his obnoxious orange clothes, out of the corner of his eyes. I suppose I'll back off for now. But if I ever find a weak spot, I'll dig at it until he tells me. I'll just make sure that no one else is around to see me do it. Sarutobi Hiruzen peered over the edge of the form he was studying at Uchiha Fugaku. You want me to approve expenses and time for Itachi to travel to Yokoshima, why? Yokoshima is one of the most corrupt cities in the Land of Fire, Fugaku replied. I want him to check on a few leads in some cases for the military police. What cases? The Hokage inquired politely. A few older cases with some loose ends, Fugaku answered, staying very vague. Hiruzen didn't like that non-answer. They must be important cases to send your clan's heir off to look into them. Itachi hasn't had much experience on solo investigations outside of Konoha, Fugaku said. I'd like for him to have more. The Hokage gave him a hard stare for another minute before setting the papers down on his desk, notating them, signing them, and stamping them with his seal. I'll give him 1 month, he decided as he handed Fugaku the copies he needed back. That should give Itachi enough time to reach the city, and return from the city, with plenty of time to investigate in between. If he needs more time, I need to have good reasons before I'll approve any extension. Understood, Fugaku grunted. You may manage your own personnel however you like within the village walls, the Hokage reminded him. But when you send them to investigate beyond Konoha, I need to know about it. My office needs to know which shinobi are available at all times in case of emergency. Thank you, Hokage-sama, Fugaku bowed, still irritated by the Hokage's curiosity, and left the office. Hiruzen sighed and puffed on his pipe as he dumped his own copies of Fugaku's paperwork in his outbox and eyed the much larger stack waiting in his inbox wearily. It never ends. A tap at one of his windows stopped him from reaching for the form at the top of that stack. He turned to see one of his umbu waiting for him there. The masked hunter had a black folder and a manila envelope in his hand. The Hokage waved his umbu in and accepted the delivery. This is the report. Yes, sir, the man with the bird mask nodded. Tell the Dorchinin that I don't want to be bothered for the next half hour unless it's a dire emergency, the Hokage commanded as he returned to his chair to read. Hi. The umbu bowed and vanished. Hiruzen settled into his set and carefully read each page of the report tucked away in the black folder. When he finished with it, he opened the envelope and pulled out a clear plastic bag with a biohazard stamp on it. Inside was a broken knife blade that was nearly black with a few smaller metallic fragments. Disgusting. He put the bag back in the envelope and put it and the black folder into one of his protected drawers. He locked the drawer with a seal so that it would be safe until he brought it home with him in the evening. Seeing that he still have nearly 10 minutes left to himself before he had to get back to immediate business, the Hokage leaned back in his chair and enjoyed the last of the tobacco in his pipe. Exhaling smoke, he turned to gaze out his leftmost window, towards Training Ground 41, the Forest of Death. So you play checkers. Interesting. Chapter 8, Fever Dreams and Nightmares. He hovered in a black place. There was no sense of time, no day, no night, no clock. He felt like he had no substance, no body, like he was a ghost. Voices whispered around him. Familiar voices, his old teammates, his students, friends long gone. He couldn't make out their words, but the sound of them comforted him in the blackness. He wanted to get closer to them, see them, touch them, smell them. But they were dead, all of them dead. For all that he was a grown man and weary of living, death still frightened him. He wanted to be with those he loved that were dead, but if he did that would mean that he was dead too. He would have to face them as a monster and spend an eternity in shame. He wanted to go to them. He wanted to flee from death. And so he hovered in the blackness and went nowhere. But, slowly, incrementally, he drifted away from the familiar whispers and the realms of the dead. His existence after that melted into a tangle of delirium. The moon grew full, grew enormous, and fell from the sky and crushed him. He smelled the food, he groped for it, he ate it. Sensei was away checking that old Tengu nest to see if it was really abandoned. The moon was full, and the client was a werewolf, and it was killing them while he just lay there with a deep bite in his shoulder and there was just so much blood. He smelled the food, he felt around for the metal bowl, and he devoured it, vaguely surprised that he had any appetite at all. He was the werewolf, and after he tore the Onna to pieces he turned to Kakashi and Rin and tore them to pieces too because he was a monster now and that was what he was supposed to do. He smelled the food and a faint medicine scent, but he was so hungry he ignored it as he wolfed down the food. The moon was full, it turned red, it turned into a giant eye, and the stars in the night sky turned into silver rain. He smelled the food and as he ate it he realized it was dog food, but he kept eating it because he was so hungry. They were arguing and she accused him of stringing her along, of not loving her, and he told her that wasn't true and blurted out that he was a werewolf and he didn't want to hurt her. He smelled the food and while he was eating it he felt a part of a pill in his mouth, but he wasn't worried. If there was medicine in his food it must be to make him well, so he should eat it. His sensei hugged him and then plunged a silver blade into his back and sorrowfully said he should have done it in the beginning. He was wet and the air smelled like a locker room shower and strong disinfecting soap. There was a chain around his neck and wrists and warm water was beating on his back. Hands and brushes rubbed at his hide. What shitty luck, stuck giving a werewolf a flea bath. Oh, shut up and keep scrub shit. The water's bringing him around. Get the tranquilizers. She came to him on the roof and hugged him and said that she didn't care, she loved him, she wasn't afraid, and she knew that he could never hurt her, and he clung to her and cried because she knew and didn't care. He smelled the food but hesitated because he thought that there might be sedatives in it and it was dog food, the cheap stuff, not the high-quality mix the Inuzukas fed their dogs, but he ate it anyway because if he didn't eat he'd never regain his strength. The moon's power buzzed through his veins and he fled, terrified that he would hurt them now that the curse had consumed him. He ran from Rin and Kakashi until he found a pile of rocks, a fresh landslide, and saw the blood, and when he moved some rocks he saw the bloody hand, and he knew the scent, and he howled in horror and sorrow and regret that he wasn't able to save Obito, too. The moon was full and even though he couldn't see it the celestial body still held strong sway over him. He paced his small cell that felt so much smaller now and felt out the walls because he could barely see them. They tried to sedate him, but the drugs only made it harder to think than it already was. His thoughts were like cold syrup, slow and sticky. The wolf's desires were sharper, faster, and he started gnawing on the bars to try and escape, even as the metal cut his gums so that he tasted his own blood. His captors were fearful, he could smell it. Their fear agitated the wolf and he chewed harder at the bars. Before things could get out of hand the sun rose, the moon's power was gone, and he collapsed into darkness. His son ran to him, but the boy's hair kept shifting between blonde and red, and when the child blinked its eyes they would change from bright sky blue to deep blue-gray and back again, and then when the boy reached him he turned into a miniature werewolf that had spots of red and yellow fur, and the werewolf son lunged to tear his throat out. He smelled the food, saw the glint of the metal bowl, and ate the food. The full moon made him jittery as he hid out in his apartment from its light, and when she came to visit him he thought of a way to try and burn off that energy. She made no protest when he started kissing her, and when he started peeling her clothes off, but when he tried to pull her necklace off she got angry and threatened to bite his ear off if he touched it again. It had been her mother's and she'd never take it off. He smelled the food, found the food, and ate it. The horde of Eastern imps seemed endless, and no matter how many he killed there was always more, and when the green and the brown ape-like demons overran his comrades he snapped and started changing even though the moon wasn't full and it wasn't even nighttime, and after he'd torn all the imps apart with his own claws he turned on his own comrades because he was a monster in a rage and only death would stop him. He smelled the food, pulled the bowl closer to where he lay, and devoured it, managing to conclude that they'd upped the dose of sedatives before he dozed off. He sat beside her on a blanket in the park and fingered her child-swollen belly while she teased him yet again about how he'd fainted when she told him, but his mind was more on the fear that always slithered behind him, the fear that somehow he would spread his curse to the unborn child and ruin the child's life before it had even begun. He smelled the food and the acrid odor of smoke, but food was more important so he ate it instead of worrying about the possibility of a fire. He howled at the full moon and then she appeared and hugged him and whispered that she still loved him, and he tore her to shred with his claws and teeth because werewolves always destroy the people and things that they love most. He smelled the food and ate it, dimly noting that it tasted a bit different. He was the werewolf and he sat out in the woods far from home, baffled by an insane human nudist that told him that he was trespassing, and since he wasn't one of the wolves who had gone insane from the change, he could go back to being a man if he wanted to, but he should find his own forest to do that in. And then the nudist turned into a werewolf and loped off, and he wondered if he could really do that, too. He smelled the food and ate it and wondered why he didn't feel queasy after eating anymore, and why his joints didn't ache, and why the silver wasn't burning his back, and was it just him, or was he suddenly able to make out the bars of his cell, and why did his head feel clearer than it had in a long, long time. In the throes of passion he bit her shoulder the way that the client werewolf had bitten him years and years before, and then the full moon rose and they became wolf monsters together, he the golden yellow wolf and she a wolf that was blood red, and they ran off into the forest together to howl at the moon and be beasts forever. He woke before the food was brought to him and wondered why, and he wondered if there was a way he could persuade his captors to feed him something more palatable than dog food, and then he spied some smudges of color, something he hadn't been able to distinguish in a long time, and he wondered about it hard. It was stupid for him to stay so close to the village in his condition, and he should leave while he still had the power to, but he didn't want to go. He'd never belonged anywhere else. The fox creature came again, as it had for several full moons, and he decided to challenge its intelligence with a game of checkers, and as it was coaxed into playing with him he wondered just what exactly it was, as it smelled like a fox, and a bit like a wolf and a human, and just how did such a thing come to exist. He sat in the far corner of his cell and ran the leathery pads at the tips of his fingers over his pelt and marveled over the fine fuzz that was starting to grow in his bald patches, and how it was a little bit harder to feel his bones under his skin. The lighting where he was kept was poor, but if he squinted he could almost make out the bars that imprisoned him and the silhouettes of the umbu that guarded him. He toyed with the idea of escaping, but his eyesight was too weak and he couldn't get a good enough grasp on his seal markers to warp anywhere, so he remained and tried to make the best of things. It wasn't time for him to be fed yet, so he closed his eyes and tried to sleep because there really wasn't anything else for him to do. It was a beautiful day as he strolled through the village in search of some present to buy for his girlfriend's summer birthday when an Uchiha, a member of the military police, walked up to him and stabbed him with a silver blade and told him that they knew what he was, and then other Uchiha came and stabbed him with more silver knives and it burned horribly. He smelled tobacco smoke and woke to find a white and red shape standing before his cell. When he identified the visitor, he pressed his belly to the floor in full submission. The wolf submitted to the alpha, and the man bowed to his master. The air was silent and tense. "Whatever am I going to do with you?" The werewolf wondered that, too. Naruto wandered the village streets, delaying his return to Iruka's apartment for a little while longer. Time had gone from flying by to crawling by and back again since the last full moon. The next full moon was only days away, and it would be the first time that he knew Owakamijiji wouldn't be there waiting for him. In the past few weeks he'd trained, done D ranks, gone to lecture classes, and even gone on another C rank. This second C rank had been a true C rank, not like the mission to Wave Country at all. They'd traveled to a small village in the south of Fire Country and exterminated a nest of small demonic insects. He and Sakura had sealed off the subterranean nest with exploding tags, and Sasuke had burned any escapees off with fire jutsu, and that had been the end of it. Lately, Sasuke had gone back to ignoring Naruto instead of trying to intimidate him. Naruto had almost started to believe that Sasuke's brother had convinced him to give up his quest, but one time when they'd been alone together after practice, the Uchiha had darkly warned him that things weren't over and he was still going to find out what his secret was. The blonde boy thought about reporting Sasuke's threat to Kakashi-sensei, but he didn't. He wanted to go try out the trials, and if their sensei thought that Sasuke was still being a nosy brat, they wouldn't be able to participate. "I wish I could have burned up some of those demon bugs," Naruto pouted, even though the mission had been a whole week ago. "I wanted to see what my fire would do to those things." Naruto glanced up at the sky and decided that it was time for him to head in. A body knocked into him and Naruto tumbled down on the sidewalk, and the black chess piece in his pocket fell out onto the concrete. "What's this?" Sasuke picked up the plastic horse head and studied it critically. "A good luck charm." "Give that back, you jerk." Naruto snarled, leaping to his feet. Naruto reached for the chess piece, but Sasuke kept it out of his reach. This piece of junk is important to you. The Uchiha sneered. How important? Quit being a dick and give it back. Naruto demanded, feeling himself start to sweat. Why should I? Sasuke shot back, tossing the game piece in the palm of his hand. It's mine. Naruto snapped. You don't see me stealing your stuff. Like you could steal anything of mine, Sasuke scoffed. Now how important is this thing to you? What would you do to get it back? Naruto clenched his fists tightly and desperately tried to think of a way to get his precious keepsake back. How about you tell me how you really defeated that Kirinin? Sasuke suggested. Why do you care so much about that? Naruto sputtered. Can't you find some other way to impress your dad? Sasuke gave him a sharp look. What makes you think I need to find that out to make my dad notice me? Naruto shrugged. Just give it back. I need to get going. It's late. Tell me what I want to know and you'll get it back, Sasuke insisted. Here, I'll help you make up your mind. I'll count to 3 and if you don't tell me I'll melt it with a fireball. Panic choked him and Naruto rushed at Sasuke to reclaim his possession only to get knocked back by a solid kick to the chest that winded him. 1. 2. 3. Not having received the information that he desired, Sasuke backed up a few steps, threw the chess piece high into the air, started the hand seals. Thwip. Both boys turned to the left and found a giant of a man standing nearby. He was tall with wooden sandals that added another few inches to his height and broad shoulders. He had shaggy white hair that was tied back in a tail and so long that Naruto wondered if the guy ever cut it. He had red lines tattooed on his cheeks that ran from under his eyes down to his jawline and what looked like a wart by his nose. He wore a red vest over drab green clothing and fishnets, a heavy pack and giant scroll on his back, and there was a metal guard over his forehead with 2 small horn-like projections and the kanji for oil painted on it. A green toad sat on the man's shoulder. It was clearly a demon due to the tufts of white hair on its head and the black cloak it wore. As it was welcome in the village, it had to be part of a demon clan that was bound by a summoning contract, which made it a trustworthy ally. The toad had caught the airborne chess piece with its tongue and now the amphibian spat the black bit of plastic into its webbed hand and offered it to the giant man. Thank you, the man said with his deep voice to the little demon toad. Now, what's the trouble here? He was going to melt it if I didn't tell him how I beat this guy who kicked his ass. Naruto said before Sasuke could give his own answer. Oh ho. The tall man chuckled. Is that so? Yeah. Naruto nodded vigorously. No. Sasuke growled at nearly the same time. The white-haired stranger walked up to them and pressed the black chess piece into Naruto's hand. Run along home now kid, and you, he jabbed a finger at Sasuke, get over it. Naruto immediately bolted for Iruka's apartment before anything else happened. I need a better place to keep this, he thought as he clutched the plastic horse head tightly in his right hand. I can't let that bastard get his hands on it again. And who was that old weirdo? Orochimaru stood over his work table in one of his underground bases tucked away in the land of rice paddies and critically studied the crumbling ancient scroll that some of his most talented minions had managed to steal for him. The pursuit of knowledge and power was his life's work and unlike most he didn't let things like morality, ethics, and his old sensei get in his way. His expulsion from Konoha Gakure no Sato had made things a bit difficult for him, but he could work with it. He'd never been widely popular in Konoha as he was a half-reptile demon that had been abandoned shortly after birth by his human mother. There had always been whispers and worries that his demon half was the dominant half. Orochimaru felt that it was, and was glad he would hate to be as weak and emotional as a pure human. In some ways, it was actually good that he was no longer a part of Konoha. He didn't have to worry about balancing missions with his research and keeping that research hidden under the Hokage's nose. He had lost easy access to human test subjects with shinobi lineage or potential, but he didn't have the problems that he used to have in smuggling in demons to experiment on. Orochimaru Dano. The snake-eyed man looked away from his study of the scroll to find Kimimaro standing in the doorway of his small laboratory. A group of 3 shinobi wish to meet with you, the pale teenager informed him respectfully. The leader says he is Kurohi Uede of Uzugakure no Sato. Uzunin. Orochimaru purred curiously. Gather your subordinates and escort our guests to my audience chamber. Konoha bowed and departed to carry out his orders. Intrigued by this unexpected visit, Orochimaru rolled the scroll back up, secured his lab, and headed for his audience chamber with no delay. The room he used to meet with those outside his organization wasn't particularly grand, but it served him well enough. His chair was comfortable and imposing and was on a raised platform that forced his visitors to look up at him. As he settled into his chair, he stewed on not achieving the position of Hokage. It was the one thing that he truly desired but could no longer achieve now that he was exiled from the village of Konoha. And for running him out of town, his old sensei would pay, and pay dearly. Before his cunning mind could slide down the familiar track of plotting vengeance against the Leaf, his guests were escorted in by Konoha, Teiwa, Kidomaru, Jirobu, Seikon, and Yukon. Two of the shinobi wore masks that were similar to Konoha's umbu, only they were solid black with colored patterns instead of white. The third shinobi wore no mask and was obviously this leader, Kurohi Ueda. He looked to be 30 at the oldest with sharp, handsome features. His hair was a blue so dark that it was almost black and his eyes were a shade of green so bright they almost seemed to glow in the dim light of the chamber. The hitayate he wore around his neck bore the spiral of the Whirlpool village. Beyond that, all three demon hunters wore the same basic attire. They were dressed in long black coats, and the two masked men had their hoods up to hide their hair. All three were armed with swords and whatever other weapons they possessed they'd either surrendered or had hidden on their persons out of sight. Orochimaru-sama, Ueda greeted with a bow that his two guards imitated silently. You are a hard man to find. It is an honor to finally meet you. It is rare that I have guests who I did not invite, the snake man remarked. What is it that you desire, Kurohi Ueda of Uzugaku no Sato? I wish to work out some kind of agreement between my village and yours, the Ozunin replied. You have knowledge that we desire and I believe we have at least one goal in common. And what goal would that be? The destruction of Konoha Gaku no Sato, Ueda answered. An ambitious goal for a small village like yours, Orochimaru said with a raised eyebrow. And a questionable one. Uzugaku no Sato has long been an ally of Konoha's. Our relationship with the Leaf has soured as of late, Ueda informed him. We wish to elevate our status above that of a lesser village and no longer depend on any tie with a greater demon hunter organization. And we desire revenge for the laxness that allowed a closeted werewolf to fornicate with one of our women. So you wish for the power to wage war and conquer far beyond your means, the half-demon summarized. What makes you think that I could assist you in that venture? We know that some of your research involves finding ways of controlling large numbers of demons, including chaotic forces like werewolves, Ueda replied. We are willing to exchange what information our village has on that subject along with other lines of your research, and furnish you with a few rare test subjects, in order to gain this information and whatever cooperation you are willing to give us in toppling the Leaf Village. You want to use werewolves against Konoha? Orochimaru chuckled darkly. A sort of poetic justice, I suppose. He leaned forward in his seat and narrowed his serpentine eyes at the younger Uzunin. What sort of rare test subjects are you offering me? Our village is too small to spare any of our shinobi, Ueda admitted, but we have access to a wide variety of sea demons, a few species of sea dragon, and, we may even be able to provide you with a few kitsune. That caught the snake's attention immediately. Kitsune. He scoffed. They are long extinct. Are they? Ueda smirked smugly. If we provide you with one, will you make a deal with us? I'm sure that one would greatly aid your research into longevity and immortality. The Uzunin was right, and Orochimaru wasn't sure that he liked that. But a kitsune to experiment on was a priceless gift. And an ally against the Leaf Village was nearly as good. If you can bring me one, I will strike a deal with you, Orochimaru agreed after several minutes of consideration. Thank you, Orochimaru-sama, Ueda said with a deep bow, that his guards once again mimicked. However, it will take time to get a hold of such a rare prize for you. May we work out some of the details of our bargain now so that as soon as the kitsune is in your possession we can get to work. My, you're a confident one, Orochimaru hissed and licked his lips with his overly long tongue as he leaned back in his chair. Very well. What other details do you wish to discuss? What plans do you have for attacking the Leaf Village? Aren't you in a hurry? The half-snake drummed his fingertips on the armrests of his chair. Here are a few of the things I was thinking of doing. Chapter 9, Secrets Under Moonlight. Itachi sat on the edge of a rooftop on the fringes of Yokoshima and sighed. The city was an absolute cesspool. And it was also a dead end, just as he'd thought it would be. When he'd paid the social services office a visit, he found that there wasn't a single staffer who had been there long enough to have processed Naruto's entry into the foster care system. From what he could tell of the place, it wasn't a stretch for the boy's caseworker to have been paid off to overlook all the problems in his paperwork and just get him started with his first family. Naruto's birth family, whoever they were, had been very thorough in getting rid of him. The only way they could have done better was to have killed him and incinerated his body. At least his stay was almost done and he was pretty much out of places to look. In a few days, he'd be free to return home and report to his father that he'd found nothing. No doubt this total lack of information would only drive his father to dig harder and deeper. Uchiha Fugaku hated not finding out what he wanted to know. Sighing deeply, Itachi looked down into the streets below and watched the civilians of Yokoshima go on about their business. Even though the sun had set an hour ago, the sidewalks were still crowded and Itachi had to wonder if the people ever slept. And his attention was immediately drawn to a trio of figures in the crowd. Activating his Sharingan, he sharpened his visual perceptions and drank in every detail. They wore long coats with hoods and moved through the civilians in formation and with purpose. If they weren't shinobi or mercenaries of some kind, Itachi would give up Dango forever. Using all his stealth and skill in a minor genjutsu cloak, the Uchiha stalked his targets. If they were of the leaf, he'd reveal himself and see what they were in Yokoshima for. If they were foreigners, he'd stay undercover and see what they were up to, because if they were in Yokoshima he doubted they were doing anything legal. The mysterious trio wound through street after street, always heading into seedier territory. Eventually they came to a very small gambling house and slipped inside. Itachi left the rooftops, hid his hitayate and all obvious signs that he was a ninja, adjusted his genjutsu cloak, and followed them in. The establishment was a pachinko parlor and Itachi settled himself in front of a game machine that was close to the dark corner where the trio had gone to. They sat there, sipping at drinks at a table. He sat at his pachinko machine and made no real effort to win anything. And time crawled by. Some time later, 3 other individuals joined the original 3 and ordered their own drinks. They too wore hooded coats and took some pains to hide their identities and be forgettable. Itachi watched them in his peripheral vision and strained his ears to hear them over the noisy gambling machines. "So when can the master expect his prize?" one of the newcomers asked. "1 week, maybe a little longer," was the reply. "Uazunin work fast," the same newcomer remarked. "This matter is important to us," was the answer from the supposed Uzunin. "We have no time to waste, Otonin." Otonin, a ninja of Otagaku no Sato, the village hidden in the sound. They were a new group, a lesser organization that had sprung up less than 5 years before, made up of rogues and dissatisfied hunters of other villages who'd been lured away by the promise of a fresh start. Little was known about them beyond their symbol, a musical 8th note, and a rumor of them being based somewhere in the land of rice paddies. Itachi listened harder. "All right," the Otonin nodded. "Upon your delivery of the creature to these coordinates," a piece of paper was slid over the tabletop, "and its confirmation of species, our master will provide you with the knowledge that your village seeks. At that time, further discussion of future plans will also take place." "Understood," the Uzunin said. "My village looks forward to it." The 2 talkers rose, shook hands, and the 2 groups of 3 parted ways. The Uzunin left first, and Itachi made no move to follow them. When the Otonin finished their drinks and left the building, Itachi tailed them. Shinobi of the Whirlpool village were more of a known quantity than demon hunters of the Sound village, so it was more important that he followed them. The Otonin moved at an easy pace, but they made no detours in leaving the city. When Itachi couldn't follow them any farther without using a heavier genjutsu, he stopped and let them leave the city fringes for the nearest border with their home country. He returned to the heart of the city to see if he could find the Uzunin again, but he knew the search would most likely be in vain. The foreign hunters would most likely be on their way home. Yokoshima was less than 3 hours of hard traveling away from the border between Fire Country and Whirlpool Country, so it was very easy for them to disappear. Uzu and Oto. Itachi frowned and glanced up at the bright full moon that hung low overhead. What are they planning? I need to let Hokage-sama know about this as soon as possible. Naruto slunk through the forest surrounding the village, at a loss as to what he should do. With Okamijiji gone, he had no checkers game to get to. Kakashi-sensei was with him again, but the Jonin just seemed content to follow him and hang on to Naruto's backpack for him. Could I find some way to ask Kakashi-sensei to train me? The fox boy wondered as he crept around on all fours. It's not like I have anything else to do, and I'm not going to sleep, so. A smell distracted him. Weird smells, strange sounds, and moving things seemed to catch his attention a lot more when he was furry. And he'd been trying to pay more attention to smells and sounds all the time now, after Kakashi-sensei had remarked how he could smell Naruto's fear that one time. What is it? He pressed his wet black nose to the ground, inhaled, and sneezed when a bit of dirt got in his nose. Ick. What is it? Intrigued, and with nothing else better to do, he tried his hand at scent tracking. It couldn't be hard. He just sniffed around and followed the smell. Kiba and Akamaru did it all the time, so he should be able to do it easily. It went this way. No, this way. Or, did it go this way? Or did it you? Is that poop? In his pursuit of the smell, he'd come across a scattering of tiny, round pellets that sort of smelled like. It is poop. Naruto wrinkled his snout in disgust and sneezed. Nasty. I have to be following an animal. Carefully walking around the tiny mess, he found the trail again and went back to following it. It was a slow process as he had no practice at going on smell alone. But there was a first time for everything, and he was curious to see what woodland critter he had scented. And then he found it. He had smelled a rabbit. The brown creature was small and hard to see in the dark, and it sat so still he almost missed it. Naruto stood frozen and wondered. Could I catch it? Rabbits were fast and agile. But in his bestial form, so was he. Surely he was faster than an ordinary rabbit. Naruto crouched down, wiggled his bushy tail, and lunged. The rabbit bolted, darting away from him as his claws just grazed its fur. And the chase was on. If the chase had gone in a straight line, Naruto would have won and caught the rabbit. But the animal zigzagged, and it was dark, and there were trees and bushes in the way. So the rabbit was winning. No stupid animal is going to beat me. Naruto thought fiercely as he ricocheted off a tree trunk after the bounding rabbit made a crazy tight turn. Come back here, damn it. I'm gonna catch you. They went left. They went right. It went under a log and he jumped over it. Twice he almost managed to catch one of its long back feet, but both times it slipped out of his grasp. It ran around a clump of bushes and he cut through them. He tripped over a root or a stone. He tumbled nose over tail down a drop-off behind the bushes. Whump. Naruto hit something solid and came to a stop upside down. Ow. What the hell? Naruto stiffened, rolled over, and tried to flee, but a hand caught the scruff of his neck and lifted him off the ground. He dangled in the air for a moment, and instinctively curled up like he was a puppy in his mother's jaws. And then the hand turned him so that he could see the white-haired man who'd captured him. What are you? It's that guy from a couple days ago. The guy with the toad who saved Okamijiji's chess piece. And, oh crap, he's got me. Crap, crap, crap. That would be Naruto, Jiraiya-sama, Kakashi-sensei said as he walked onto the scene. This is. The man squinted at him. Really? Really? The man, Jiraiya, frowned at Naruto. He used the hand that wasn't holding the fox boy's scruff to examine Naruto's tail, paws, and head. When a finger irritated his ear, Naruto slapped the hand away. Huh. Jiraiya lowered him to the ground, but didn't let go of his neck fur. Why does he look like a fox? He smells a lot like one, too, Kakashi-sensei informed him. And we don't know why. The white-haired man gave him another long look. Interesting. Not really, Naruto thought as he tried to back away, but couldn't because Jiraiya hadn't let him go yet. I'm not interesting at all. So, You really let him change with the moon, the man muttered. And he stays lucid? There's no increase in aggression. From what he claims, he's in perfect control of himself no matter his shape. But the way he chased that rabbit makes me wonder. I just wanted to catch it. I wasn't going to eat it. That's gross. That was a rabbit chase, eh? Jiraiya finally let go of Naruto's neck and patted him on his fuzzy head. Better luck next time, you little furball. Naruto glared and flattened his ears. I'm not a furball. He makes a cute little critter, the white-haired man remarked. I'm sure that Minato would have liked him. Eh? Naruto tilted his head curiously. Who's Minato? Probably, Kakashi-sensei said. But let's not talk about that now. Naruto has daddy issues. I have. Naruto bristled and scooted backwards a bit. That's his name, isn't it? See. His sensei said, gesturing towards him. He says his werewolf heritage got him disowned and washed through the foster care system. So Sarutobi-sensei told me, Jiraiya grunted. Although I find it hard to believe that a kid wouldn't be the least bit curious about the people he came from. Naruto snorted in disgust and turned around to sit with his back to the two adults to show his disdain for the subject of their conversation. Brat, Jiraiya grumbled. And here I was prepared to tutor the kid, maybe even take him on as an apprentice. I think I've changed my mind. Tutor me? Naruto peered over his shoulder. Make me his apprentice? Don't be so hasty, Jiraiya-sama, Kakashi-sensei advised. You can study him while you teach him. That is, if you're still interested in werewolves. I was more interested in finding a cure, Jiraiya replied. Not that my efforts ever did Minato any good. Naruto also has some interesting non-werewolf traits, too. The silver-haired Jonin turned to the fox boy. Why don't you show him your little fire trick? Naruto turned back to face them and held his hand palm up. He concentrated his chakra to spark the fire, and was surprised at how quick and easy it was. When he made the fire with minimal transformation, it took more effort and concentration. The white-haired hunter frowned at the blue fire orb that hovered inches over Naruto's claw tips. That looks like Kitsunebi. The fox boy went very still and the little fireball winked out like a light bulb. It does, Kakashi-sensei agreed. I'd ask about it, but any probing into his background makes him dangerously skittish. He looked like he was having a meltdown when we were trying to confirm his parentage a couple of months ago. Jiraiya gave Naruto a long, hard stare. Naruto looked back and gulped. He wasn't sure what he thought of this man. The giant had saved his precious keepsake from Sasuke, but he also appeared to think highly of Naruto's werewolf father, which didn't make him seem very smart. Any extra training is good training, right? I suppose I'll give him a trial run, the man said at last. If he impresses me, then I'll see about further training. Jiraiya stood up from the ground, dusted off his pants, and patted Naruto's head roughly as he strode off into the dark woods. Remember, brat, impress me. Naruto shook himself a bit and huffed at Jiraiya's retreating back. Weirdo. You hear that, Naruto? Kakashi-sensei said to him. Impress the man. Look him up after the next team practice. Okay, Naruto nodded, and then started sniffing the air. Now where did that rabbit go? And no more rabbits tonight. Darn it. Sasuke sat on the back porch of his house and glared up at the night sky. Nothing seemed to be going his way, not since the mission to Wave. His performance hadn't impressed his father, he couldn't get the bit of information that would impress his father, and Itachi had been gone for weeks now, so he had no training partner for working with his Sharingan. At least I found a weak point on Naruto, he thought. I need to steal that Black Knight from him again, and make sure there are no interruptions. He really wanted that cheap bit of plastic back. The sound of footsteps on the wooden boards of the porch distracted him from his thoughts, and Sasuke turned, to find his father approaching. He unconsciously straightened up and waited to see what his father would do. His dad probably wouldn't stop to speak with him, but it was better to be safe than sorry. His father stopped and sat beside him. Your mother tells me that you asked about Uchiha Madara. Sasuke nodded. He'd intended to ask Itachi after he'd heard the name in class, but by the time he'd returned home his brother had left the village. When it became clear that his brother would be gone for weeks, he'd asked his mother about the name, but she'd gotten nervous and told him to ask his father. Sasuke was leery about trying to talk to his father without being approached first because he was always so busy that he'd decided to wait until Itachi came home to find out about this Kitsune-slaying ancestor. Why? Iruka-sensei gave lecture on the Kitsune and the name came up, Sasuke replied. I'd never heard it before and I was curious. I see. His father stared over their back lawn for a moment. Uchiha Madara once led our clan, and was instrumental in the founding of Konoha Gakure no Sato. Along with Senju Hashirama he gathered together the first clans and was almost made the first Hokage. What happened to him? Sasuke asked. If he's so great, how come I never heard of him before? He used dangerous techniques and overtaxed his Sharingan. He ruined his eyesight and was left nearly blind. The Uchiha's strength is the Sharingan and without his vision he was left almost useless. Desperate to restore his sight, he shamed himself and the entire clan. Sasuke was shocked. He shamed the Uchiha. Yes, his father nodded grimly. Healing techniques could not restore his sight. Any benefit they gave him was undone with the next demon hunt. Many demons have the power to heal themselves, but humans can't become demons. But Madara heard a rumor that he felt would be the solution to his problem. A rumor? Sasuke repeated, knowing that he sounded stupid but so drawn into his father's scandalous tale that he couldn't help himself. Madara heard whispers of a creature native to far western lands, a creature whose bite could change the victim into a monster. He traveled to find this curse-born beast and incited one to bite him. The curse infected him and the healing powers it brought slowly restored his sight. But not too long after he returned to the village, the curse drove him mad and he spread his magical disease to whoever he could reach. Sasuke gaped at his father's profile, too stunned to spit out even a stupid question. He became a werewolf and was single-handedly responsible for spreading the affliction of lycanthropy to our continent. With the shinobi still fixated on the great hunt for Kitsune, the problem Madara caused was not properly addressed. By the time the Kitsune were officially declared extinct, lycanthropy was becoming an epidemic. His father paused and turned to face him with a grim expression. The Uchiha clan was held responsible for Madara's crimes. It didn't matter that he'd been a good man before the wolf bite. Others saw the madness of his curse and thought that he'd always been mad, power-hungry, and dangerous. And they attributed those same tendencies to the rest of the clan. We bear the shame of his mistakes, and every day the whole clan struggles to overcome the dishonor he put upon us. We must be the best that we can be to prove that we are not him, that we are better than him, and that we will never become him. And to make up for his crime of bringing lycanthropy to the land, we must slay every werewolf we can find to try and cleanse our corner of the world of this disease. Do you understand, Sasuke? Sasuke nodded emphatically. I understand, father. Jiraiya sat up in a tree and watched as Kakashi set up a tracking exercise for Naruto with the help of some of his dog summons. The fox boy, Fox, if there was such a thing, had been rather put out at not being allowed to track rabbits, so the silver-haired Jonin was trying to find some other way to put his energy to use. It was interesting to observe the little demon dogs lay down ever more complex trails and watch the boy blunder through them. If only Minato was here to see this. He'd known that it had been likely to happen that Minato could one day be consumed by his lycanthropy. From that one horrible night when Minato's teammates had been slaughtered and Minato bitten, he'd known that the possibility was real and strong. Minato had managed so well for a long time, though, and that was probably why it had been such a rude shock when it had finally happened. There was simply no way to hide from the moon forever. When it had first been clear that the curse had taken hold of his student the first time his skin had burned from contact with silver, Jiraiya should have ended him, quickly and painlessly. He made the excuse that he wanted to find a cure, a way to break the curse, and so he kept his student alive, and lied about the incident, blaming a canine demon so that no one would suspect anything, to be a guinea pig. But it was a flimsy excuse, and he'd never really been able to test anything on him out of fear that it would fail and Minato would transform and be lost. The truth was that he'd been weak. He'd lost 2 out of the 3 children that had been placed in his care. The one that he had left was so brilliant, so trusting, so good. He just couldn't do it. Even if Minato had been exposed to the full moon in front of him and turned into a beast that tried to bite him, he wouldn't have been able to slay his beloved pupil. I'm just like Sarutobi-sensei that way, he thought. He couldn't kill Orochimaru, even knowing what he did to those people. I couldn't kill Minato, even if I tried. The Toad Summoner closed his eyes and tried to turn his thoughts away from his lost student. Lamenting over the past would only get in the way of the present. And the present was figuring out what to do with his godson. After Minato's discovery and disgrace, Jiraiya had gone into self-imposed exile, unable to bear the ugly whispers about his protege. Kushina had left not long after that for the same reason, and probably in an attempt to protect her not-yet-born son from the suspicion that would fall on him because of his father. If only he'd stayed, or she'd stayed, perhaps the boy could have avoided being bounced around from foster home to foster home. I'll find some way to look after you, kid, like your parents wanted me to. He'd worry about the bizarre kitsune traits later. Perhaps it was some mutation of the werewolf curse. No one had ever encountered a werewolf's child before. Or maybe he was some kind of throwback. Kitsune had freely bred with humans, maybe their traits had lain dormant for generations in Kushina's line before being awakened by Minato's lycanthropy. Whatever it was, he'd worry about it later. That's it for part 3. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.